Gun here, sir. It's on the dresser.
Where's it at?
It's over there. I cleared it. Nope, no, sir. That's on by my TV. No, sir. Other TV behind me. 10 millimeter.
All right.
Yeah, it was right next door.
Where's Daddy at?
Upstairs. First room on the right.
Is that the gun?
Yes.
Is it clear up there? Can they
Yeah, it's clear.
Sir.
There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room after something that cannot be undone. Not the quiet of rest, not the stillness before sleep, the kind that follows an irreversible sound. It was just before 11 o'clock on a Friday night in January when patrol officers in Lake Township, Ohio, received a call about a shooting inside an apartment. A young girl, someone on the other end of the line saying it was an accident. The first officer to reach the building made contact with a teenager near the entrance. What he heard was not a scream, not panic, not the desperate urgency you would expect from someone who had just watched a friend get shot. It was flat, almost offhand. So, the body is upstairs. The body. Not, she's hurt. Not, please, hurry. The body. As if the language had already decided what she was before the officers ever walked through that door. Upstairs, in a room decorated with Second Amendment flags and firearm memorabilia, lay Symini Moore, 15 years old, a high school sophomore. The kind of unremarkable evening teenagers don't think twice about, because why would they ever need to? She would not be going home. The 18-year-old performing chest compressions when officers arrived was named Jakob Heintzelman. And what he said in the hours that followed, to officers, to detectives, to the uniformed officer sitting with him in that interview room, would raise questions that no story about a jammed gun could fully answer. Because sometimes, the most unsettling thing in a room isn't what happened. It's the person who doesn't seem to understand that it should bother him. Step back from that apartment for a moment. Before the body cam footage, before January, before any of this. Symini Moore Sini, to everyone who knew her, was 15 years old and doing everything right. She was a high school sophomore, an honor student, the kind of student who shows up, who puts in the work, who leaves an impression not because she was trying to, but simply because of who she was. She had friends who kept up with her. She had people who loved her, the kind where you make plans without weighing them, because at 15, you aren't yet thinking about all the ways an ordinary Friday can turn. The people who grieve her describe a girl who was present, attentive, someone who made the people around her feel like they mattered. That is not a small thing to lose. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of thing that cannot be replaced. Before we go any further, if you're someone who needs to understand why people do the things they do, you're exactly where you should be. This is the Malice Mind. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, back to Sini. On the evening of the 23rd of January, 2026, Sini and a group of friends ended up at the apartment of an 18-year-old named Jakob Heintzelman in Lake Township, Ohio. The precise details of how she came to be there, the social connection, the specific invitation are not fully established in the publicly available footage. What is documented on body cam, and in Heintzelman's own words, is that Sini was in his bedroom that night, lying on his bed, head pointed toward him, the way you position yourself when you're comfortable, when nothing in the room feels dangerous. friends around her, a television on. An ordinary Friday. That is the last version of that night anyone should have to imagine. But there is another one, the one that actually happened. And it started, according to Heintzelman, with a gun that was jammed. The 23rd of January, 2026. Lake Township, Ohio. Just before 11 at night, a 911 call was placed from inside the apartment. Officers responded. When the first body cam recorded the inside of that bedroom, they found Heintzelman already on his knees performing CPR on Symini Moore, who was on the floor. Officers called for medics. Heintzelman stood. And then, in the middle of an active scene where a 15-year-old girl lay unresponsive on the floor of his apartment, he said something that stopped at least one person in that room cold. He mentioned his shoes, specifically that he had noticed blood on them, and that he had gone and washed it off. He had washed the blood off his shoes. A girl he knew was dying in his apartment, and at some point in the minutes before help arrived, his attention had found his shoes. Officers secured the scene. The firearm, a 10mm pistol, was recovered upstairs. Heintzelman identified it without prompting. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there might be a .22 in the room as well. Then he started talking. He said the gun was jammed. He said he had been cleaning it, a nightly routine, he called it. He said he had cleared the chamber, disassembled the slide, and as he went to reassemble it, the weapon fired. He insisted his hand had never been on the trigger. He said this had never happened before in his life. He said he had done this 1,000 times. Investigators took note of all of it, the claim, the composure, the speed with which he explained himself. And they started looking at everything surrounding what he said. Because in a room full of guns, flags, and a 15-year-old girl who would not survive the night, the story about a jammed slide was only the beginning of what they were trying to understand. By the time detectives were called to the scene, Heintzelman had already told his story to multiple officers. The core of it did not change. The gun was jammed. He was cleaning it. It discharged unexpectedly. An accident. A terrible one, he allowed, but an accident. What investigators noticed was not the content of the story. It was the delivery. Heintzelman was calm. Not the shaky, suppressed calm of someone fighting tears. Not the hollow calm of someone emptied out by shock. An almost easy calm, the kind that sits in a person who feels, on some level, like they have things managed. He spoke about gun mechanics with the fluency of someone who had been speaking that language for years. By his own account, he had. He mentioned a background that included military service, the Marine Corps, and said he had been out for approximately 3.5 months. He described his firearm the way some people describe a hobby, with knowledge, with detail, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who considers himself an authority. He knew what the spring looked like. He knew what the slide was supposed to do. He mentioned a possible mechanical issue, rust, or what he thought might be orange paint, near the barrel spring. He referenced a similar unintentional discharge from a friend's gun. He worked to establish, conversationally and without apparent calculation, that this kind of malfunction was a known phenomenon. Investigators were listening to everything. The firearm would be submitted to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the BCI, for forensic analysis to determine whether the weapon's mechanism was consistent with an unintentional discharge. But the physical evidence was only one part of what was developing. Heintzelman, transported to the station and placed in an interview room to await the formal detective interrogation, continued to talk. A uniformed officer sat with him. The conversation that followed was, by any objective measure, unusual. He catalogued his collection, an AR-10 that had once tried to chamber 2 rounds simultaneously, jamming the bolt solid. The 10mm pistol recovered from the bedroom. A-22, he'd mentioned upstairs. A friend who was planning to gift him a fully modified M16 dual laser, optic-mounted, completely built out as an early birthday present. He spoke about wanting to buy another pistol, same model as the one that had just killed a teenage girl with his next paycheck. He described the moment of discharge twice that night, in 2 different conversations. In the interview room, to the uniformed officer, he said it this way: "As soon as I turned it around, I heard click. Boom. It was that simple. Hand wasn't even on the trigger. Click. Boom. That simple." A 15-year-old girl was dead in his apartment, and the sentence that contained it had 4 words. Then there was what he said he did in the minutes between the shot and the 911 call. By his own account, his first action was not to call for help. It was to clear the gun again. He said he wanted to make certain it was safe. He retrieved an intact round that ejected during that second clearing. He set it next to the discharged casing. Then he called 911. He described all of this without visible distress. Later, in the interview room, the conversation turned to the reactions of others inside the apartment at the moment of the shooting. Heintzelman mentioned that Sini's best friend had made a joke in the immediate aftermath. He said he understood the impulse. He described using humor to cope. He said when his grandfather died, he handled the grief with jokes. He laughed at the memory of it, quietly, briefly, but he laughed. When it came time to transport him to the station, Heintzelman asked how long he might be held. He seemed surprised by the answer. He laughed again. In a phone call placed from the interview room while waiting for the detective to arrive, he mentioned being hungry. He wondered, aloud, whether DoorDash could deliver to a police station. He said he hadn't eaten in 2 days, then noted he supposed he couldn't exactly arrange for food delivery right now. Not a breakdown. Not visible anguish. Not the kind of interruption you would expect in a man who truly understood what he had just done. Just a man, warm in a room, running calculations about dinner. Investigators noted all of it, and they kept looking. The formal detective interrogation came after the wait. The full contents of that interview have not been publicly released as of this reporting. What followed it is documented. Officers returned to the interview room and placed Heintzelman under arrest. He was cooperative. He asked about his vapes. He asked whether he might be able to retrieve phone numbers from his cell phone before it was booked into evidence he had been told earlier that he could. The officer explained the phone was already sealed and in booking. He accepted that. His phone, already in an evidence bag, was about to tell investigators far more than he appeared to expect. A grand jury indicted Heintzelman on multiple counts: reckless homicide, improperly handling a firearm in a motor vehicle, carrying a concealed weapon, and failure to comply with underage alcohol laws. The transportation charge stemmed from evidence that on the day of the shooting, Heintzelman had driven with the weapon loaded and accessible inside his vehicle. But the digital forensic examination of his phone uncovered something that extended far beyond a night in January and far beyond the story of a jammed gun. Investigators found material on Heintzelman's phone that led to an additional charge: illegal use of a minor in nudity-oriented material. Unquote. Prosecutors were unambiguous on one point. The victim in that case was not Symini Moore. This was a separate individual, a separate violation. A pattern of harm that had existed before January 23rd and existed entirely apart from what happened in that bedroom. In April of 2026, after initially entering a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, a court found Heintzelman competent to stand trial. In May, he pleaded guilty. Reckless homicide with a gun specification, improper transportation of a firearm in a motor vehicle, carrying a concealed weapon, an underage alcohol violation, and illegal use of a minor in nudity-oriented material. 5 counts. The man who said he had done this 1,000 times, who said he was disciplined, meticulous, careful with firearms, who said it had never happened before. He pleaded guilty to killing a 15-year-old girl, and the phone in his pocket on the night she died had contained evidence of harm to yet another child. What does the documented evidence tell us about how Jakob Heintzelman processed what happened? Not as a legal matter, that question has already been answered by a grand jury, a competency evaluation, and a guilty plea, but as a behavioral one. Because Heintzelman gave investigators an unusual volume of material to work with, hours of conversation, documented affect, a consistent, almost collaborative self-presentation across multiple officers and multiple settings, and beneath all of it, a behavioral pattern that forensic analysts would find difficult to overlook. Start with affect. In the immediate hours following a fatal shooting, Heintzelman did not demonstrate emotional distress consistent with the circumstances he claimed to be in. He did not cry. He did not appear to struggle to speak. He spoke at length about gun mechanics, about his collection, about his service history, about wanting another firearm by his next paycheck. He laughed more than once. In forensic psychology, affect that is inconsistent with stated experience is a recognized behavioral marker. It is important to note that trauma can produce flat affect that is real and clinically documented. People in genuine shock can appear numbed, hollow, seemingly indifferent to events they are actually devastated by. But clinical literature draws a distinction. Trauma-induced flatness typically includes disruptions, moments where the flattened surface cracks, a catch in the breath, a pause that breaks the rhythm, a brief intrusion of something uncontrolled through an otherwise managed exterior. Those breaks were not visible here. What Heintzelman showed instead was consistent and maintained composure paired with a near-continuous focus on practical concerns, the status of the gun, his legal exposure, his belongings, his comfort, and when he might be released. Behavioral analysts note that this kind of pattern maintained calm, practical orientation and deliberate narrative control aligns with characteristics described in literature on the dark triad framework. Specifically, traits associated with subclinical narcissism and reduced affective empathy. His verbal minimization of Sini's death is also documented and notable. When describing the discharge, Heintzelman said, "As soon as I turned it around, I heard click, boom. It was that simple. Hand wasn't even on the trigger. Click, boom, that simple." A 15-year-old girl shot in the head in his apartment, and the language he reached for was that simple. Behavioral analysts describe this pattern as affect-congruent minimization, using flat, mechanical language to frame an event as contained, bounded, survivable, not necessarily a deliberate strategy, but a deeply revealing one. The language a person reaches for under pressure tells you something real about what their mind is protecting and what it is not. The charge revealed on his phone adds a dimension no behavioral analysis can responsibly ignore. The material investigators found on Heintzelman's device, child exploitation material, unrelated to Sini Moore, belonging to a separate victim, was not impulsive. It was not the product of a single night. It had existed before January 23rd. It had been collected, retained, stored. Behavioral analysts describe documented patterns of predatory orientation toward minors as a behavioral footprint, not proof of intent in a concurrent criminal matter, but evidence of a sustained set of interests that defines, in part, who a person is more broadly. Which means that when a group of teenagers that included a 15-year-old girl ended up inside his apartment, the picture of that night becomes more complicated than a story about a misfired slide. No formal diagnosis is being offered here. That is not the purpose of this analysis. What the evidence does document consistently and without ambiguity is a young man who, in the hours after a child died inside his home, spoke primarily about himself, his knowledge, his routine, his minor inconveniences, his hunger. That is not a clinical conclusion. It is simply what happened. At sentencing, the numbers were laid out plainly. 7.5 years in Ohio State Prison for reckless homicide with a gun specification. 4 years for the illegal use of a minor in nudity-oriented material. 11.5 years in total. Upon release, Jakob Heintzelman will be designated a Tier 2 sex offender. He will be required to register with the sheriff's office every 6 months for 25 years. And Symini Moore Sini will be 15 years old forever. An honor student, a high school sophomore, a girl whose friends came with her that night and who are going to carry the weight of that Friday for the rest of their lives. She deserved decades. She had every reason to expect them. That is the part no sentence changes. The question that lingers, the one that does not fully close regardless of what a court rules, is not whether the discharge was accidental. It's whether the person whose hand held that gun ever truly grasped what he took from the world. In the hours of footage he gave us, in the laughter, the food order, the question about how long this would all take, the calm assessment of his shoes, it is difficult to find the evidence that he did. Cases like Sini's remind us that behind every headline is a life that existed fully, completely, right up until someone decided it shouldn't. If that thought stays with you, it should. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if the Malice mind is where you come to understand the darkest corners of the human mind, subscribe.